blood, power, and a perfectly rolled R. When you run the most ruthless syndicate in Chicago, you expect fear. You expect silence. You certainly don't expect a tired waitress in a stained apron to casually correct your formidable mother's centuries-old Sicilian dialect. I was sitting at the head of the table at Austero Venenti, untouchable and utterly bored, until she opened her mouth. Her words weren't just perfect Italian, they were a lock picking its way into my heavily guarded soul. It was supposed to be a simple family dinner. Instead, it was the night a girl making minimum wage altered the entire balance of the Chicago underworld. The Friday night rush at Osteria Valenti on Rush Street was notoriously brutal. For Sophia Gallica, it was just another shift in a seemingly endless cycle of exhaustion. At 24, Sophia carried the weight of a ghost her father, Thomas Gallagher, a charming but deeply flawed man who had recently vanished, leaving behind a staggering $50,000 debt to Mickey Sullivan, a ruthless loan shark operating out of the West Side. Sophia's survival strategy was simple. Keep her head down, serve the osso buco, and hand over every spare tip to Sullivan's collectors on the first of the month. She was practically invisible, hidden beneath a white apron and a messy bun, navigating the crowded dining room with the precision of a ghost, until the front doors opened and the temperature in the room seemingly plummeted. The Costa family had arrived. Alessandro Costa didn't just walk into a room, he claimed it. Dressed in a sharply tailored midnight blue Brioni suit, his presence demanded a terrifying level of respect. He was the undisputed head of the Costa syndicate, a man whose legitimate real estate ventures barely masked his control over the city's port operations. Beside him walked his mother, Carmela, a woman whose elegant posture and icy demeanor made her the true matriarch of the family. Trailing them were four men whose bulky jackets did little to hide the steel they carried. The maître nearly tripped over his own feet rushing to clear the restaurant's most secluded, opulent corner booth. Waiters actively avoided eye contact, terrified at spilling a drop of water and incurring the wrath of a man who could make them disappear before dessert. Sophia drew the short straw. A manager shoved a pristine menu into her chest, his face pale. Table 7. Don't speak unless spoken to. Pour the Barolo, take the order, and vanish. Approaching the table, Sophia felt the heavy, suffocating aura of power. Alessandro was staring at his phone, his jaw tight, a faint scar tracing the line of his cheekbone. Carmela, however, was scanning the room with absolute disdain. "Buonasera," Sophia murmured, keeping her voice level as she poured the vintage red wine. Carmela didn't look up. Instead, she leaned toward her son and muttered in a thick, rapid-fire dialect. It wasn't standard Italian. It was Palermitano, a heavy Sicilian dialect spoken almost exclusively by the old guard. "Questi posti sono un insulto. Guardala, siate I ignoranti. Probabilmente si serve cibo in scatola. Non sanno niente del rispetto. These places are an insult. Look at her, sloppy and ignorant. She'll probably serve us canned food. They know nothing of respect." Alessandro barely nodded, indifferent to his mother's habitual complaining. Sophia's hand didn't tremble. She finished pouring the wine, placed the bottle perfectly on the coaster, and looked directly into Carmela's dark, judgmental eyes. When Sophia spoke, her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the hum of the restaurant like a stiletto. "Con tutto il rispetto, signora," Sophia began, her accent shifting flawlessly from Midwestern American to the exact guttural cadence of Carmela's native Palermo. "Il nostro chef è di Trapani. Il sugo bolle da stamattina alle 6 e vi assicuro c'è l'unica cosa in scatola in questo edificio. E gaisi esiariti di dice prima di assaggiare." "With all due respect, madam, our chef is from Trapani. The sauce has been simmering since 6 this morning, and I assure you the only thing canned in this building is the arrogance of those who judge before tasting." The silence at the table was immediate and deafening. The bodyguards shifted, hands moving subtly toward their lapels. Carmela's mouth fell open, her carefully constructed mask of superiority shattering completely. But it was Alessandro who reacted in a way no one expected. He dropped his foam. His dark eyes snapped up, locking onto Sophia with the intensity of a predator realizing the prey has teeth. He didn't order his men to throw her out. He didn't raise his voice. He leaned forward, a slow, dangerous smirk spreading across his face. Where did an Irish girl from Chicago learn to speak the language of my grandfather's enemies? My mother was from Palermo, Mr. Daunt. Costa, Sophia replied, holding his gaze despite the frantic beating of her heart. And she taught me never to let a guest go hungry or unchallenged. Are we ready to order? Alessandro stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then a low chuckle rumbled from his chest. I'll have the veal, Sophia, he said, reading her Namatak, and my mother will have whatever you recommend. After all, she wouldn't want to be arrogant. For the rest of the night, Alessandro's eyes tracked her every movement. Sophia had survived the dinner, but as she wiped down the tables after closing, a sinking feeling settled in her gut. You don't insult a Mafia boss's mother and walk away unnoticed. She hadn't just spoken Sicilian, she had painted a giant target on her own back. The clock struck 2:15 a.m. as Sophia locked the heavy service door behind Osteria Valenti. The Chicago air was biting, carrying the smell of rain and damp asphalt. She pulled her threadbare coat tighter, mentally calculating how many shifts she needed to afford the upcoming week's groceries, while still keeping Sullivan's collectors off her porch. As she stepped out of the alley onto State Street, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. A sleek, heavily tinted Lincoln Navigator was idling by the curb, its engine purring with a low, menacing hum. The rear window rolled down silently, revealing the sharp, aristocratic profile of Alessandro Costa. "Get in, Sophia," he commanded. It wasn't a request. Panic flared in her chest. "My shift is over, Mr. Costa. If you want a late-night reservation, you'll have to call in the morning." A massive man stepped out of the driver's side, easily 6'5", built like a brick wall. He didn't draw a weapon, but the way he blocked her path to the subway station was all the threat necessary. "I don't make reservations," Alessandro said, his voice smooth and cold. "And I don't repeat myself. Get in. You have nothing to fear from me tonight, but you have everything to fear if you walk away." Swallowing her terror, Sophia slid into the luxurious leather interior. The doors locked instantly with a heavy thud. Alessandro poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter, offering her one. She didn't take it. "Why are you following a waitress?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts. "I'm not following a waitress. I'm recruiting an asset," Alessandro replied, taking a slow sip. He opened a manila folder, resting on his lap. "Sophia Gallagher, 24. Mother died when you were 10. Father is Thomas Gallagher, a man who currently owes $52,000 to Mickey Sullivan's crew, a debt you are hopelessly trying to pay off by pouring wine and serving pasta." Sophia's blood ran cold. "How do you know that?" "It is my business to know everything that happens in this city," Alessandro stated, closing the folder. "Sullivan is losing patience. I happen to know he plans to collect in blood by the end of the month. You are out of time, Sophia." Tears pricked her eyes, a mixture of fear and profound exhaustion. "If you brought me here to gloat, or to use my debt to threaten me, just get it over with." "I brought you here to offer you a job," he countered, his gaze piercing through the dim light of the cabin. "Tomorrow night, I am hosting a private dinner at my estate in Lake Forest. I am sitting down with Don Vincenzo, an old-school rival from New York. He is a paranoid, dangerous man who refuses to speak English during negotiations. My usual translator was indisposed." "You have a dozen men who speak Italian," Sophia argued. "I have men who speak street Italian. I have men who speak modern Italian. Vincenzo speaks a highly archaic, specific dialect from the rural hills of Sicily. a dialect almost identical to the one you threw in my mother's face tonight. Alessandro leaned in closer, the scent of expensive cologne and danger washing over her. I need someone who doesn't just translate words, but reads between the lines. Someone who understands the poison hidden in the poetry. Someone who isn't intimidated by power. I am completely intimidated by you. Sophia blurted out. Alessandro smiled, a genuine, startling expression that softened his harsh features for a fraction of a second. Good. Fear keeps you sharp. But you hit it beautifully in the restaurant. Do that tomorrow night, and I will hand you a cashier's check for $60,000. Your father's debt vanishes, and you walk away free. $60,000. It was a lifeline thrown into a raging ocean. But grabbing it meant pulling herself onto a pirate ship. And if I refuse, then I drop you off at your apartment and we never speak again. You will face Sullivan's collectors alone. He paused, his eyes tracing the delicate line of her jaw. But we both know you aren't going to refuse. You are a survivor, Sophia, and survivors do what is necessary. She stared at the manila folder, the symbol of her drowning reality. She took a deep breath, her Sicilian blood rising to meet the challenge. I need a dress, and I want the check in my hand the second the dessert plates are cleared. Deal, Alessandro said smoothly. My driver will pick you up at 6. The Costa estate was less of a house and more of a fortress disguised as architectural brilliance. Tucked away in the affluent, heavily wooded enclaves of Lake Forest, the mansion boasted wrought-iron gates, perfectly manicured gardens, and enough armed security to invade a small country. Sophia stepped out of the SUV, pulling a sleek, floor-length black gown tightly around her. Alessandro had sent a stylist to her apartment that afternoon. Looking in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. The tired waitress was gone. In her place was a woman who looked like she belonged in this dangerous, gilded world. Alessandro stood on the front steps, flanked by his highest-ranking lieutenants. When he saw her, his conversation stopped dead. For a long moment he simply stared, his eyes dark and unreadable, before stepping forward and offering his arm. You look, he started, hesitating for a rare second. Formidable. Formidable. I feel like a lamb dressed up for slaughter, she whispered back, resting her trembling hand on his bicep. Keep your head up, Sophia. Tonight, you are a Costa. Act like it. The dining room was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The long mahogany table was set for only 3. At the far end sat Don Vincenzo, an elderly man with skin like wrinkled parchment and eyes like black obsidian. He radiated a quiet, terrifying malice. His own guard stood in the shadows, their eyes locked on Alessandro. The dinner began in heavy, suffocating tension. Vincenzo spoke exclusively in rapid, gravelly Sicilian. Sophia sat beside Alessandro, leaning in to whisper the translations into his ear. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, the absolute focus he maintained on his rival. Dice che il porto di Chicago è troppo grande per te da solo. Suggerisse di condividere l'accordo per evitare che la tempesta distrugga I campi. He says the Chicago port is too large for you alone. He suggests sharing the harvest to prevent a storm from destroying the fields. Tell him the harvest is already gathered and my silos are fortified against any storm, Alessandro replied smoothly. Sophia translated his words flawlessly, capturing not just the literal meaning but the steel in Alessandro's tone. Vincenzo's eyes narrowed as he looked at her, realizing she wasn't just a pretty escort but a sharp intellectual weapon. For 2 hours they volleyed threats disguised as metaphors over roasted duck and fine wine. It was going remarkably well. Alessandro was asserting dominance without crossing into outright disrespect. Then coffee was served and Vincenzo made his final play. He leaned forward, smiling a thin, snake-like smile, and spoke softly. Allora, Alessandro, accetto le tue condizioni. Domani gli uomini si ritireranno, ma in cambio Richido un piccolo pegno di buona fede. C'è il tuo luogotenente. Marco incontri mio figlio al molo di mezzanotte da solo per firmare I documenti. Sophia paused, the translation dying on her tongue. The room went perfectly still. Alessandro looked at her, waiting. Translate, Alessandro murmured, his jaw tense. He said, he accepts your terms. He will withdraw tomorrow, Sophia whispered. She hesitated, her heart hammering against her ribs. She recognized the specific phrasing Vincenzo used. It was an old country idiom, a dark piece of slang her mother used to warn her about back-alley dealings in Palermo. Incontrare al molo di mezzanotte didn't just mean a meeting at the midnight dock. In this specific dialect, it was a coded execution order. It meant sending a man to sleep with the fishes. He wants Marco to meet his son to sign the papers, she continued, her voice trembling slightly. But Alessandro don't agree. The phrasing he used, it's a trap. It translates literally to a meeting, but in the old slang he's asking your permission to assassinate Marco to settle an old blood feud. If you say yes, Marco is dead, and you will have sanctioned it. Alessandro's posture didn't change, but Sophia felt the muscle in his arm turn to granite. He slowly turned his gaze back to Vincenzo, his expression a mask of absolute chilling calm. Tell Don Vincenzo, Alessandro said, his voice dropping an octave, that Marco is family, and the Costa family signs its papers in the daylight. If his son wishes to meet, he can come to my office at noon. Otherwise, there is no deal, and the storm can come. Sophia translated the rejection, perfectly mirroring Alessandro's cold authority. Vincenzo's smile vanished. He realized his trap had been exposed. He stared at Sophia with pure, unadulterated venom, recognizing that this young woman had just cost him his revenge. With a stiff nod, Vincenzo stood up. Nessun accordo. He spat and stormed out of the room, his men trailing behind. Silence descended on the dining room, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock. Alessandro stood slowly, pouring himself a measure of scotch. He drank it neat, his back to her. You just saved my lieutenant's life, he said quietly, the gravel in his voice more pronounced, and quite possibly prevented a war that would have torn this city apart. I just translated what he said, Sophia breathed out, the adrenaline finally crashing, leaving her shaking. He turned around, walking slowly toward her. He stopped inches away, invading her personal space, his imposing frame blocking out the rest of the room. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp cashier's check. $60,000. He held it out to her. Sophia reached for it, her fingers brushing against his. The spark of electricity between them was undeniable, heavy with the adrenaline of the night. Instead of letting go of the paper, Alessandro's hand gently caught hers. He looked down at her, the cold, calculating Mafia boss entirely stripped away, leaving only a man completely captivated. My mother called you ignorant, he murmured, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. My rivals thought you were just an ornament. But I see exactly what you are, Sophia. And what is that? She whispered, unable to look away from his dark, intense eyes. A revelation, he said softly. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a husky whisper that sent shivers down her spine. I brought you here to be a voice. But tonight, you stole my heart. The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded with a terrifying promise. Sophia knew she should take the check, walk out of the estate, and never look back. She had her money, she had her freedom, but as she looked up into the eyes of Chicago's most dangerous man, she realized the most terrifying truth of all. She didn't want to leave. The morning sun did nothing to warm the bleak industrial stretch of South Halsted Street in Canaryville. Sophia stood outside O'Rourke's auto body, her fingers curled so tightly around her leather purse that her knuckles were white. Inside that purse was a cashier's check for $60,000, bearing the elegant, terrifying watermark of the Bank of Geneva. It was the price of her freedom. She pushed open the heavy metal door, the scent of motor oil, stale beer, and cheap cigars hitting her like a physical blow. Mickey Sullivan's base of operations was a far cry from the velvet ropes and truffles of Osteria Valenti. In the back office, visible through a smudged glass window, sat Sullivan himself, a thick-necked, red-faced man whose penchant for violence was legendary on the South Side. Sophia walked past two mechanics who looked more like linebackers, her heels clicking against the concrete floor. She didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed open the office door. Sullivan looked up from a ledger, his cold, pale eyes narrowing. "Well, if it isn't Tommy Gallagher's little girl. You're lost, sweetheart. The soup kitchen is 3 blocks down." "I'm not here for charity, Mickey," Sophia said, her voice surprisingly steady. The adrenaline from her night with Alessandro Costa was still thrumming in her veins, making Sullivan look significantly less intimidating than he had a week ago. She unzipped her purse, pulled out the cashier's check, and slapped it onto his greasy desk. 52,000 for my father's principal and vig. The extra 8 is to ensure neither you nor your collectors ever look in my direction again." Sullivan stared at the piece of paper. He didn't reach for it. Instead, a slow, ugly grin spread across his face, revealing a gold-capped tooth. He leaned back in his squeaky chair and laced his thick fingers together. "That's a very pretty piece of paper, Sophia. And it looks authentic, too, which begs the question of whose bed you had to warm to get it." He chuckled, a wet, rasping sound. "But you're a day late and $1 short." Sophia's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about? The deadline is Friday. Today is Wednesday. The money is all there." "The money doesn't matter anymore," Sullivan said, sliding the check back toward her with the tip of a pen. "I don't hold Tommy's marker. I sold his debt yesterday afternoon." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced her chest. "You sold it? To who?" "Who buys a gambling debt from a loan shark?" "Someone who made me an offer I couldn't refuse. Someone who carries a lot more weight in this city than I do." Sullivan stood up, suddenly looking nervous, glancing toward the door. "Take your check and get out, Sophia. Your father's problem belongs to the Italians now." The Costa family bought the paper. The floor seemed to drop out from under her. Alessandro, he hadn't given her the $60,000 to free her. He had given her a meaningless piece of paper while simultaneously buying the very chains that bound her. He had played her with the flawless, ruthless precision of a grandmaster moving a pawn. Sophia didn't remember walking out of the garage. She barely remembered hailing a cab on Halstead. All she felt was a blinding, white-hot fury. 33 Wacker Drive, she told the driver, her voice trembling with rage. Step on it. The Costa Enterprises building was a towering monolith of glass and steel in the loop, a legitimate architectural marvel that housed Alessandro's sprawling real estate empire. Sophia marched through the pristine marble lobby, ignoring the protests of the security desk. She stepped into the executive elevator, hitting the button for the penthouse suite before the guards could catch her. When the doors opened on the top floor, she was immediately blocked by Matteo, the massive, broad-shouldered lieutenant whose life she had saved the night before. "Miss Gallagher," Matteo said, his gruff voice laced with a surprising amount of respect. "The boss is in a meeting." "I don't care if he's meeting with the Pope, Matteo." "Move," she demanded. Matteo hesitated, glancing at the heavy oak doors of Alessandro's office. Before he could speak, the doors parted. Alessandro stood in the threshold, dressed in a charcoal three-piece suit, looking every inch the untouchable king of Chicago. His dark eyes locked onto her, reading the absolute fury in her posture. He dismissed 3 men in his office with a flick of his wrist. They filed out silently. "Let her in, Matteo," Alessandro commanded softly. Sophia stormed past him, slamming the oak doors shut herself. She marched right up to his massive mahogany desk and threw the cashier's check directly at his chest. It fluttered uselessly to the floor. "You lied to me," she breathed, her voice shaking with a dangerous mix of anger and betrayal. You sat there in your beautiful house, you handed me that check, and you told me I was free, but you had already bought my father's debt. You didn't hire me to translate, Alessandro. You bought me." Alessandro didn't flinch. He slowly walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River, his hands resting in his pockets, the silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "I didn't lie to you, Sophia," he finally said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I gave you exactly what you earned for your work. You saved Matteo's life. You earned every penny of that 60,000. Then why buy the debt from Sullivan?" She yelled, the tears of frustration finally spilling over. "Why keep me trapped?" Alessandro turned around. The cold, calculated mask was gone, replaced by a fierce, terrifying intensity. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, closing the distance between them until she was forced to tilt her head up to meet his gaze. "Because Mickey Sullivan wasn't going to take your money, Sophia," Alessandro said, his tone dropping to a harsh whisper. "My men intercepted a communication yesterday morning. Sullivan's crew in Canaryville had grown tired of your father. He had stolen from one of their stash houses to feed his habit. They weren't going to collect the debt. They were going to take your 60,000 and then put a bullet in Tommy's head as a lesson to the neighborhood." Sophia froze, the breath catching in her throat. "No." "Yes," Alessandro insisted, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders gently, steadying her trembling frame. "I bought the debt to strip Sullivan of his claim. And then I had Matteo extract your father from a crack house on the south side at 3 in the morning. Where is he?" she whispered, her anger instantly evaporating, replaced by a hollow terror. "He is safe. I had him transferred to a private, highly secured rehabilitation clinic in Geneva. He is detoxing under 24-hour medical supervision." Alessandro's thumbs brushed against her collarbones, his touch sending an involuntary shiver through her. "I didn't buy the debt to trap you, Sophia. I bought it to keep you from walking into a slaughterhouse this morning. You are entirely free to walk out that door right now, cash that check, and never see me again. Your father's debt is forgiven." She stared up into his dark eyes, searching for the deception, the manipulation. But all she found was a raw, fierce protectiveness that terrified her even more than his power. He had moved mountains, broken syndicate rules, and spent his own money, all to save a waitress's deadbeat father. "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why would you do all of that for me?" Alessandro's gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second before meeting her eyes again. The air between them crackled with an unspoken, heavy electricity. "Because since the moment you corrected my mother's Sicilian," he murmured, stepping so close she could feel the heat radiating through his suit, "I haven't been able to think of a single goddamn thing besides you." 3 days passed in a surreal haze. Sophia didn't return to Osteria Veneti. Instead, she found herself officially on the payroll of Costa Enterprises as a cultural consultant, a title Alessandro invented to keep her close, operating out of an office just 3 doors down from his. The transition from serving pasta to reading archaic Italian ledgers and navigating the legitimate side of a Mafia empire was jarring, but it was the quiet moments that unraveled her the way Alessandro's eyes tracked her when she entered a room, the possessive hand he placed on the small of her back when guiding her through the lobby, the rare, genuine smiles he reserved only for her. But in the underworld, peace is just a delayed war. And Don Vincenzo was not a man who forgave insults. It was a rainy Tuesday evening. Alessandro was tied up in a meeting with city aldermen negotiating zoning permits. Sophia, feeling a bout of cabin fever, insisted on leaving the corporate tower to grab a coffee from a small, family-owned bakery in Pilsen, her old neighborhood. Alessandro had strictly forbidden her from going anywhere alone. He had assigned Matteo as her permanent shadow. "Boss is going to have my head for letting you out in the open, Riscalico," Matteo grumbled as they stepped out of the black SUV onto the rain-slicked pavement of 18th Street. "It's just coffee, Matteo. Sophia smiled, pulling her trench coat tighter against the wind. "And please call me Sophia. You make me sound like a mob wife." Matteo didn't smile. His eyes were scanning the street, his right hand hovering near the opening of his jacket. "I call you what the boss tells me to call you. And right now he treats you like royalty, so you're Miss Gallagher. Let's make this quick." They walked into the warm, cinnamon-scented bakery. Sophia ordered her coffee and a pastry, chatting in Spanish with the owner, Mrs. Garcia. For a fleeting moment she felt normal again, but as she took her cup and turned toward the door, the world exploded. The front window of the bakery shattered inward in a terrifying hail of glass and suppressed gunfire. The deafening pop-pop echoed through the small space. "Get down," Matteo roared. He lunged forward, throwing his massive body over Sophia, tackling her behind the thick oak display counter, just as a second volley of bullets tore through the espresso machine, sending scalding water and shrapnel flying across the room. Mrs. Garcia screamed, diving into the kitchen. Sophia hit the floor hard, the breath knocked out of her lungs. Her ears were ringing violently. She tasted dust and blood her own, from a shallow cut on her cheek where a piece of blast had grazed her. "Stay down. Do not move," Matteo yelled over the chaos. He drew his weapon, a heavy Glock, and peeked over the counter. He fired 3 rapid shots toward the street. A man yelled in pain outside. Tires screeched on the wet asphalt. A dark sedan peeled away, the roar of its engine fading into the distance. Silence slammed back into the bakery, thick and heavy, broken only by the hiss of broken pipes and Sophia's ragged breathing. Matteo pulled her up roughly, his eyes wide with a terrifying urgency. "Are you hit?" he demanded, running his hands over her arms, checking for blood. No, I'm okay. Just the blast," she stammered, wiping the blood from her cheek with a shaking hand. Matteo pulled his radio from his belt, his voice deadly calm. "Code red in Pilsen. Drive-by. The girl is secure. Get the boss on the line. Now." Within 4 minutes the street was swarming with Costa men. The black SUV was pulled right onto the sidewalk. Matteo shoved Sophia into the back seat, climbing in beside her. They didn't go back to the corporate tower. They drove north, tearing through red lights, heading straight for the Gold Coast. "Who was it?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling as the shock began to wear off, leaving behind a bone-deep chill. "Vincenzo," Matteo said grimly, reloading his weapon. "He lost face at the estate. He couldn't hit the boss, and he couldn't hit me. So he went for the one thing the boss suddenly cares about." The words hit her harder than the concrete floor. She was the target, because of Alessandro, because she mattered to him. The SUV pulled into the subterranean, highly secured parking garage of a luxury high-rise. Matteo escorted her into a private, biometric elevator that shot them straight to the penthouse. The doors opened into a sprawling, aggressively modern apartment with panoramic views of Lake Michigan. It was cold, beautiful, and utterly devoid of personal touch. It was a fortress. Less than 10 minutes later, the elevator doors slammed open again. Alessandro walked in. He looked like the devil incarnate. He had abandoned his suit jacket and tie. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his sleeves rolled up. But it was his face that was terrifying. The composed, untouchable Don was gone. In his place was a man consumed by a violent, unhinged panic. He bypassed his men completely, his eyes locking onto Sophia sitting on the edge of a leather sofa. He crossed the massive living room in seconds, dropping to his knees on the hardwood floor in front of her. "Sophia," he breathed out, the word sounding more like a prayer. His large hands reached up, framing her face. He was trembling. Alessandro Costa, the man who controlled the Chicago underworld with an iron fist, was shaking. His thumbs traced her jawline, stopping at the shallow cut on her cheek. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice a lethal, vibrating whisper. He didn't look at Matteo. He kept his eyes entirely on her. "Matteo said it was Vincenzo's men," she whispered, leaning into his touch instinctively, craving the sudden, overwhelming safety his presence provided. Alessandro closed his eyes, a muscle feathering in his jaw. When he opened them again, the panic had hardened into a terrifying obsidian resolve. "I'm going to burn his entire world to the ground," he stated, as casually as if commenting on the weather. "I'm going to drown him in the lake for daring to look in your direction." "Alessandro, I'm fine. Matteo saved me," she said, her hands coming up to grip his wrists. "Don't start a war over a broken window and a scratch." "A scratch?" He stood up suddenly, pulling her up with him. He wrapped his arms around her, crushing her against his chest. It wasn't a gentle embrace. It was desperate, possessive, born of pure adrenaline and fear. "Do you have any idea what happened to me when my phone rang and Matteo said you were under fire?" My heart stopped beating, Sophia. I felt my soul leave my body. She buried her face in the crook of his neck, inhaling the scent of rain, expensive cologne, and the sharp, metallic tang of gunpowder that seemed to cling to him. "You are not going back to your apartment. You are not going back to the office," he commanded, his lips brushing against her hair. "You are staying here, with me, where I can see you, where no one can touch you." She pulled back slightly, looking up into his dark, storm-filled eyes. The barrier between then the boss and the employee, the mobster and the civilian, was completely shattered. There was no hiding the truth anymore. "I don't belong in this world, Alessandro," she whispered, a tear finally slipping down her cheek. "I'm just a waitress from Pilsen." "Now, Topo." "You haven't been a waitress since the moment you spoke Sicilian to my mother," he replied, his gaze dropping to her lips. His hand slid down to her waist, pulling her flush against him. "You are mine. You have been since that night at the restaurant, and I protect what is mine." He didn't give her a chance to argue. He brought his mouth down on hers, the kiss mirroring the violence and desperation of the evening. It was acclaiming, fierce, demanding, and utterly consuming. Sophia didn't pull away. She grabbed the lapels of his shirt, pulling him closer, surrendering completely to the terrifying, intoxicating gravity of the Mafia boss who had bought her debts, saved her father, and just declared war on the entire eastern seaboard, all because she stole his heart. The morning after the shooting, the penthouse was suffocatingly quiet. Outside, a grey storm battered the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Gold Coast high-rise, matching the turbulent anxiety churning in Sophia's stomach. Alessandro had left before dawn. He hadn't worn a suit. He had worn a black tactical jacket, his face an unreadable mask of impending violence, taking Matteo and 24 heavily armed enforcers with him. He was going to war, and he was doing it for her. Sophia paced the expansive hardwood floors, her bare feet padding softly against the imported rugs. 2 guards stood outside the double doors of the penthouse, silent sentinels ensuring her absolute safety. At noon, the heavy oak doors clicked open. Sophia spun around, expecting Alessandro's towering frame, praying to see him uninjured. Instead, the sleek, imposing figure of Carmela Costa stepped into the foyer. She wore a charcoal grey Chanel suit, her silver hair pulled back into a severe chignon. She looked past the armed guards in the hallway and dismissed them with a sharp wave of her manicured hand. The doors shut heavily behind her. Sophia's spine stiffened. The matriarch of the Costa family didn't just drop by for tea, especially not while her son was out orchestrating a bloodbath. "Signora Costa," Sophia said, keeping her distance, her voice polite but guarded. Carmela didn't answer immediately. She walked slowly through the living room, her dark, judgmental eyes scanning the space. Noting Alessandro's jacket thrown over a chair, Sophia's shoes by the door. She moved to the crystal decanters on the wet bar and poured herself a small glass of mineral water. "My son has always been prone to grand theatrical gestures," Carmela finally said, her voice dripping with aristocratic disdain, switching effortlessly to the archaic Sicilian dialect that had started this entire chain of events. "Compra I tuoi 2 debiti," ti metti nel suo castello di vetro. Pensa di poter trasformare una cameriera in una regina. He buys your debts, puts you in his glass castle. He thinks he can turn a waitress into a queen. Your son saved my life, Sophia replied, matching her dialect perfectly, refusing to back down. E non ho mai chiesto di essere una regina. And I never asked to be a queen. Carmela offered a thin, razor-sharp smile. She set her glass down and reached into her designer handbag, pulling out a thick, leather-bound envelope. She tossed it onto the glass coffee table. It landed with a heavy, substantial thud. There is an account of the Credit Suisse branch in Zurich, Carmela stated smoothly, switching back to English to ensure absolute clarity. $5 million. The passport inside is pristine, registered under the name Isabella Rossi. There is a private jet idling at O'Hare, ready to take you to Geneva, where your pathetic father is currently recovering on my son's dime. You will take this envelope, you will get on that plane, and you will disappear from Alessandro's life forever. Sophia stared at the envelope, her brow furrowing. You're trying to buy me off, while Alessandro is out risking his life fighting Vincenzo's men? Carmela let out a dry, humorless laugh. Vincenzo is an old, predictable fool. He operates on pride and archaic rules. He doesn't have the imagination nor the resources to track a single civilian woman to a bakery in Pilsen. The air in the room seemed to freeze. The breath hitched in Sophia's throat as the horrifying implication of Carmela's words set in. "What are you saying?" Sophia whispered, the hair on her arm standing up. Carmela took a slow, deliberate step forward, her eyes gleaming with ruthless pragmatism. "I am saying that Vincenzo only knew where you were because I sent a courier to his lieutenant with the address. I gave him the opening." A sickening wave of nausea washed over Sophia. The drive-by, the shattered glass, Matteo diving over her. "You orchestrated a hit on your own son's territory?" Sophia choked out, stepping back, horrified by the monster standing in front of her. "You could have gotten me killed. You could have gotten Matteo killed." "Casualties of maintaining an empire," Carmela said coldly, devoid of any maternal warmth or human empathy. "Alessandro has spent his entire life building the Costa syndicate into a legitimate, untouchable powerhouse. He is ruthless, calculated, and perfectly focused. Until you. You are a weak link, a distraction, a bleeding heart from the South Side who makes him act emotionally. The moment he bought your father's paper from that filthy street thug Sullivan, I knew you had to be excised from the equation. So you used Vincenzo as a weapon," Sophia realized, the puzzle pieces violently snapping together. "You tipped him off, knowing he'd take the shot at me. If Vincenzo killed me, your problem was solved. And if he missed, Alessandro would declare war on Vincenzo, wiping out a rival family. Either way, you win. I am the mother of this syndicate," Carmela hissed, her composure slipping to reveal the venomous snake beneath. "I protect the family. You are a parasite. Take the $5 million, Sophia. Because if Vincenzo's men couldn't finish the job, I assure you my personal guards will not miss. Not at short. She isn't taking a dime." The voice was low, vibrating with a lethal, terrifying stillness. Carmela physically flinched, spinning around. Sophia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Alessandro stood in the doorway of the master bedroom. He had used the private service elevator, bypassing the front guards completely. He was covered in the dust and grime of the streets, a dark smudge of ash on his jawline, his tactical jacket unzipped. He looked like a god of war who had just walked out of hell. And he had heard everything. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence that precedes an execution. Alessandro didn't look at Sophia. His dark, furious eyes were locked onto his mother. He walked slowly into the living room, his footsteps echoing like gunshots against the hardwood. "Alessandro, Carmilla started, her voice wavering for the first time. You must understand, I did this for the family. For you. You did this for power, Alessandro corrected, his voice a chilling monotone. He stopped a few feet from her, towering over the woman who had brought him into the world. I just spent the last 6 hours dismantling Don Vincenzo's entire operation. My men seized his docks, burned his warehouses, and I personally looked him in the eye as he was exiled from this city. I did all of that because I thought he had dared to touch what is mine. He looked down at the Swiss bank envelope on the table. He picked it up and casually tossed it into the unlit fireplace. Vincenzo swore on his deathbed that he received a tip. Alessandro continued, the muscle in his jaw flexing violently. I thought he was lying to save his own skin. I didn't want to believe that the rot was inside my own house, that my own mother would feed the woman I love to the wolves. The woman I love. Sophia inhaled sharply, the words piercing through the terror and adrenaline, anchoring her to the floor. She is nothing, Carmilla shrieked, dropping her aristocratic facade completely. She is a waitress. She brings you nothing but debt and vulnerability. Your father would be ashamed of what you have become. My father died bleeding out in a gutter because he trusted the wrong people, Alessandro fired back, his voice finally cracking like thunder. I built this empire to be better than the filth of the old country. And Sophia, he finally turned his gaze to her, the murderous fury in his eyes instantly melting into a fierce, unwavering devotion. Sophia saw me. She saw the monster, she saw the power, and she didn't flinch. She stood in front of you, a woman who terrified grown men and put you in your place. She is 10 times the Costa you will ever be. Carmilla sneered, raising her chin defiantly. So what will you do, Alessandro? Will you kill your own mother for a street rat? The commission will never stand for it. No, Alessandro said smoothly, a chilling calm returning to his voice. He snapped his fingers. The front doors of the penthouse opened. Matteo walked in, flanked by 2 men Sophia didn't recognize. They looked grim, official, and utterly loyal to Alessandro. I'm not going to kill you, mother, Alessandro said, stepping aside. I'm going to erase you. Matteo has booked you on a private flight leaving from Midway in 1 hour. You are going back to Palermo. You will reside in the convent of Santa Maria. You will have no phone, no internet, and no contact with the outside world. If you attempt to leave the grounds, the guards I have stationed there will break both of your legs. You are officially dead to the syndicate, and you are dead to me. Panic, raw and unfiltered, finally broke across Carmella's face. To be stripped of her power, exiled back to the archaic world she had fought so hard to leave it, was a fate worse than a bullet. Alessandro, please, you cannot do this, she begged, lunging forward. Matteo stepped between them smoothly, gripping Carmella's arm with an iron hold. Time to go, Signora, Carmilla screamed, cursing him in rapid-fire Sicilian as Matteo and the guards forcibly dragged her out of the penthouse. The heavy oak doors slammed shut, cutting off her voice, plunging the room back into silence. Alessandro stood perfectly still for a long moment, his chest heaving, staring at the closed doors. He had just severed the deepest tie he had, fracturing his own soul to protect hers. Sophia didn't hesitate. She ran to him. She threw her arms around his waist, burying her face into the rough fabric of his tactical jacket. Alessandro let out a ragged breath, his arms coming up to wrap around her tightly, crushing her against him as if she were the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. He buried his face in her hair, breathing her in deeply. It's over, he murmured, his voice hoarse. Vincenzo is gone. My mother is gone. Sullivan wouldn't dare look in your direction. It's over. Sophia pulled back just enough to look up into his exhausted, beautiful face. You exiled your own mother for me. I would burn the entire world to ash for you, Sophia, he said, his thumbs coming up to wipe away a stray tear from her cheek. I told you you stole my heart. I am just a man trying to protect what little soul I have left, and it all belongs to you. No, so I'm bold, and so I Sam. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black velvet box. He didn't drop to one knee. There was no room for traditional romance in the aftermath of a Mafia war. Instead, he simply flipped it open, revealing a breathtaking, flawless, emerald-cut diamond ring. "I don't know how to be a normal man," Alessandro said, his dark eyes locking onto hers with searing intensity. "I can't offer you a quiet life. There will always be shadows. There will always be danger. But I can offer you absolute loyalty. I can offer you an empire. Be my partner, Sophia. Be my queen." Sophia looked at the ring, then up at the man who had bought her debts, saved her father, and waged war against his own blood to keep her safe. The waitress from Piosen was gone forever. She had learned the language of power, and she was ready to speak it fluently. "I don't want a quiet life, Alessandro," she whispered, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across her face. "I want you." Alessandro's eyes darkened with raw hunger and profound relief. He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, a heavy, permanent claim. He pulled her in, his mouth crashing down on hers in a kiss that tasted of victory, survival, and a love forged in the fires of the Chicago underworld. Epilogue 1 year later. The Friday night rush at Osteria Valenti was notoriously brutal. The restaurant was packed with politicians, socialites, and men with heavy jackets and dangerous eyes. Sophia Costa sat at the head of the secluded corner booth, dressed in a stunning midnight blue silk gown. She sipped a vintage Barolo, her emerald-cut diamond catching the dim candlelight. Beside her sat Alessandro, his arm draped possessively over the back of her chair, his eyes scanning the room with the quiet, terrifying authority of a king. A new, terrified waitress approached the table, her hands shaking as she poured the water. Sophia smiled warmly, reaching out to gently touch the girl's wrist, steadying her hand. "Take your time," Sophia said softly. "You're doing perfectly fine." The waitress exhaled a breath of relief, nodding gratefully before scurrying away. Alessandro chuckled low in his throat, leaning in to press a kiss to Sophia's temple. "You are entirely too soft on the staff, mia regina." It sells. Allora, someone has to balance out the terror you strike into their hearts, Sophia teased, turning her head to kiss him properly. They were the undisputed rulers of the city, a syndicate run not just on fear but on a terrifying, unbreakable intellect, blood, power, and a perfectly rolled R. Sophia had walked into the lion's den to pay a debt, and she had ended up owning the entire jungle. If the story of dark romance, underworld drama, and a waitress who outsmarted a mafia matriarch kept you on the edge of your seat, we need your help to bring more thrilling content like this to life. Tap that like button if you love the explosive twists, and don't forget to share this video with your friends who are obsessed with mafia romance, secret identities, and undeniable chemistry. Want to hear more gripping stories where power meets passion and the underdog takes the crown? Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below telling us which scene was your absolute favorite. Did you gasp when Carmela's true motives were revealed? We read every single comment. Join our community today and let's keep these thrilling, high-stakes stories rolling. See you in the next one.